In 1785, on the frozen Finnmark Plateau, Sami herder Aslak faced a truth his ancestors never had to confront. The old Lavvu could no longer protect his family. Winters were growing harsher, storms more violent, and after losing his young son in a blizzard, he vowed never to let the cold claim another life. So he set out to reinvent the tent his people had relied on for centuries. Drawing on generations of knowledge, he dissected every detail of the traditional Lavvu, its conical frame, its smoke hole, its layers of hide. But instead of preserving it, he reimagined it. Through months of experiments, failures, and quiet breakthroughs, he discovered that warmth didn't come from thicker walls alone, but from controlled airflow, insulation gaps, and the extraordinary properties of reindeer hide. His solution was radical: a breathable, three-layered lavvu that trapped heat like a furnace, yet stayed fresh and smoke-free even in the dead of winter. How did one herder turn a simple tent into one of the Arctic's most ingenious survival machines and transform the future of his people? Part 1. The wind that swept across the Finnmark Plateau on the morning of October 15, 1785, was a harbinger of the coming winter. It was a raw, biting wind, born in the high Arctic of Eurasia, and it carried the scent of snow and ice. It whispered of the long, dark months of the Kamos, the polar night, when the sun would disappear below the horizon for weeks on end. Aslak, a Sami reindeer herder, felt the wind's chill in his bones. He stood on a small rise, his gaze fixed on the vast treeless tundra that stretched before him, a rolling sea of brown and gray under a pale, unforgiving sky. At 35, Aslak was a man in his prime, his body lean and hard from a life lived on the move. Born on March 12, 1750, in a Lavvu on the spring migration route near the Tana River, he had known no other life than that of a reindeer herder. His face, weathered by the sun and wind, was a testament to his resilience, his eyes a startling blue against his tanned skin. He was a man of few words, a man who preferred the company of his reindeer to the chatter of the market towns. He was a man of the old ways, a man who lived in harmony with the rhythms of the seasons, the migrations of the herds. His father, Niels Aslaksen, had been a master herder before him, teaching him the ancient skills that had been passed down through countless generations since the Sámi first began herding reindeer in the early 17th century. Below him, his family's Sida, or herding group, was preparing for the autumn migration. The air was filled with the sounds of activity, the lowing of the reindeer, the barking of the dogs, the shouts of the herders as they rounded up the animals. The women were busy packing the sleds, their colorful woolen shawls a bright splash of color against the muted landscape. The children, their faces rosy with the cold, ran and played, their laughter carried on the wind. This was the life Aslak had always known, the life his father and his father's father had lived before him. It was a hard life, a life of constant struggle against the elements, but it was also a life of freedom, of a deep, abiding connection to the land and the animals. But in recent years, the winters had been growing harsher, the snows deeper, the cold more intense. The old ways, the ways that had sustained his people for centuries, were no longer enough. The previous winter had been one of the harshest on record. The first snows had come early, on September 28, 1784, and by November 3rd, the temperature had already dropped to 25 degrees below freezing. On February 10, 1785, a fierce blizzard had swept across the plateau, a storm of such ferocity that it had caught even the most experienced herders by surprise. The wind had reached speeds of over 100 kilometers per hour, and the temperature had plunged to 40 degrees below freezing. Aslak's family had been caught out on the open tundra, their Lavvu, the traditional Sámi tent, battered by the wind and snow. The fire in the center of the tent had been extinguished by the driving snow, and the family had huddled together in the darkness, their bodies slowly succumbing to the numbing cold. Aslak's youngest son, a boy of 5 named Niels, had died in his arms that night, his small body a frozen, lifeless weight. The memory of that night was a raw, open wound in Aslak's heart. He had failed his son, he had failed his family. He had followed the old ways, he had built the Lavvu as his father had taught him, but it had not been enough. The old ways were no longer enough. He was determined that this winter would be different. He would not lose another child to the cold. He would find a way to build a Lavvu that could withstand the fiercest blizzard, a Lavvu that could trap the heat of the fire like a furnace, a Lavvu that would be a true sanctuary against the Arctic winter. He had spent the summer months, from June 5th to September 20th, 1785, experimenting with new designs, new materials, new techniques. On June 10th, he had begun by carefully observing the structure of a traditional Lavvu, measuring its dimensions, noting the placement of the poles, the arrangement of the hides. On June 25th, he had built a small-scale model, testing different configurations of poles and coverings. On July 8th, he had consulted with an elderly herder named Mikkel, a man of 83 who had seen more winters than anyone else in the Sida. Mikkel had told him stories of the old days, before the Norwegians had come, before the taxes had been imposed, when the Sámi had lived in perfect harmony with the land. On July 22nd, he had examined the reindeer hides with a new eye, studying the structure of the hollow hairs, marveling at their insulating properties. On August 5th, he had conducted experiments with fire, testing different types of wood, different arrangements of the hearth, different sizes of the smoke hole. He had studied the way the wind flowed over the tundra, the way the snow drifted, the way the fire burned. He had observed the reindeer, their thick, hollow-haired coats, a marvel of natural insulation. He had talked to the old herders, the men who had seen more winters than he could count, gathering their stories, their wisdom, their knowledge. He had learned that the traditional Lavvu, with its conical shape and its single layer of reindeer hides, was a compromise. It was designed for mobility, for ease of transport, for a life lived on the move. It was not designed for the extreme cold of the deep winter. It was a temporary shelter, not a permanent home. He had also learned that the key to heat retention was not just insulation, but also air circulation. The fire in the center of the Lavvu created a column of warm air that rose and escaped through the smoke hole at the top. This created a draft, pulling cold air in from the bottom of the tent. The traditional Lavvu was a chimney, not a furnace. Aslak knew that he had to find a way to break this cycle, to trap the warm air, to create a closed system that would recycle its own heat. He had an idea, a radical, untested idea, an idea that went against all the traditions of his people. He would build a Lavvu with 2 layers of reindeer hides, an inner and an outer layer separated by a gap of air. The air gap, he reasoned, would act as a powerful insulator, trapping the heat from the fire and preventing it from escaping into the cold Arctic air. He would also create a system of vents, of flaps, of adjustable openings that would allow him to control the airflow, to regulate the temperature, to create a Lavvu that could breathe, that could adapt to the changing conditions of the weather. It would be a Lavvu that was not just a shelter, but a machine, a finely tuned instrument for survival. He had shared his idea with his wife, Ellen, a strong, practical woman who was the heart of their family. She had listened patiently, her hands busy with the mending of a reindeer hide. She had seen the pain in his eyes, the fierce, unwavering determination in his voice. She had lost a son that winter, too. She knew that the old ways were no longer enough. She had given him her blessing. He had also shared his idea with the other herders in his Sida. They had been skeptical. They were men of tradition, men who were wary of change. They had seen too many new ideas, too many improvements from the outside world, that had only brought them hardship and sorrow. They had been taxed by the Norwegian government since the 17th century, their lands encroached upon, their way of life threatened. They were a proud, independent people, and they were suspicious of anything that smacked of the outside world. But Aslak was not an outsider. He was one of them. He was a master herder, a man who knew the ways of the reindeer, the ways of the tundra. He was a man who had suffered as they had, suffered, who had lost a child to the cold. They listened to him, they respected him, and in the end, they agreed to let him try. And so, on that crisp autumn day in 1785, as the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, Aslak began the work of building his new Lavvu, his furnace tent. It was a project that would test his skills, his knowledge, his endurance. It was a project that would pit him against the full force of the Arctic winter. It was a project that would determine the fate of his family, the future of his people. It was a project that would change the way the Sámi lived in the frozen north forever. Part 2, the work of building the furnace tent, began on October 20th, 1785, a crisp, clear morning when the temperature stood at -5 degrees Celsius. The first task was to select the poles. Aslak had learned from his research that the traditional three-pole tripod, while elegant in its simplicity, was not strong enough to support the weight of a double-layered covering. He needed a more robust structure, a structure that could withstand not only the weight of the hides, but also the accumulated snow and ice of a long Arctic winter. The traditional Lavvu was built with a tripod of 3 forked poles, with 10 or more straight poles laid against them. But Aslak's new design required a stronger, more stable frame. He selected 4 forked poles, each one a sturdy birch tree that he had felled himself in the forests to the south. He stripped the bark, he notched the forks, he shaped the poles with his axe, his hands moving with the sure, practiced skill of a master craftsman. He then selected 20 straight poles, each one a slender, flexible birch sapling that he had cut on October 18th from a grove near the Karasjok River. Each pole was approximately 4 meters in length and 5 centimeters in diameter at the base. He had carefully chosen saplings that were straight, free of knots, and flexible enough to bend without breaking. The selection process had taken him 2 full days, from October 16th to October 18th, as he had examined hundreds of trees before finding the 20 that met his exacting standards. These would form the ribs of the Lavvu, the framework that would support the 2 layers of reindeer hides. He laid the poles out on the ground, arranging them in a circle, their tips pointing towards the center. He then raised the 4 forked poles, interlocking their forks to form a sturdy, self-supporting tripod. He then laid the straight poles against the tripod, their tips resting in the forks, their bases forming a wide, circular footprint on the ground. The frame was larger than a traditional Lavvu, with a diameter of nearly 5 meters. It was also lower, its profile more squat, more stable. Aslak had learned from his observations of the wind that a lower, wider structure was less susceptible to the force of the gales that swept across the tundra. The traditional Lavvu, with its tall, conical shape, was like a sail, catching the wind, straining against its moorings. Aslak's new design was like a rock, hugging the ground, deflecting the wind, its stability enhanced by its lower center of gravity. The next task was to prepare the reindeer hides. This was a long, arduous process, a process that had been perfected by the Sámi over centuries of trial and error. The hides had to be scraped clean of all flesh and fat, a messy, smelly job that was usually done by the women. The hides were then stretched and dried, a process that could take several weeks. Finally, the hides were softened by rubbing them with a mixture of animal brains and fat, a process that made them pliable and waterproof. Aslak had selected the hides for his furnace tent with great care. He knew from his experiments that the quality of the hides would be critical to the success of his design. The hides had to be thick enough to provide insulation, but not so thick that they would be too heavy or too stiff. They had to be waterproof, but also breathable. They had to be durable, able to withstand the abrasive force of the wind-driven snow and ice. On September 15, 1785, he had begun the process of selecting the hides from the animals that had been slaughtered during the autumn cull. He had examined each hide carefully, checking for tears, for thin spots, for any signs of disease or damage. He had measured the thickness of the fur, which ranged from 2 to 3 centimeters on the bull hides and from 1 to 2 centimeters on the calf hides. He had tested the flexibility of the leather, bending it, stretching it, making sure that it would not crack or tear under stress. He had chosen the thickest, most heavily furred hides, the hides of the bull reindeer that had been slaughtered in the autumn. He had also chosen a number of smaller, lighter hides, the hides of the calves that had been born in the spring. These would be used for the inner layer of the tent, their softer, finer fur providing a more comfortable living environment. He needed nearly 60 hides to cover the large frame of his new Lavvu. It was a staggering number, representing the pelts of approximately 15 adult reindeer and 30 calves. In a traditional Sida, where each family typically owned between 50 and 100 reindeer, this was a significant investment. The hides alone represented a value equivalent to 3 months' worth of food for his family. But Aslak was determined. He had calculated that the double-layered design would reduce the amount of firewood needed to heat the tent by approximately 50%, a savings that would more than compensate for the initial investment in hides over the course of a single winter. It was a huge investment of time and resources, a testament to the seriousness of his purpose. The other herders in his Sida watched him with a mixture of awe and skepticism. They had never seen a Lavvu built with such care, with such attention to detail. They had never seen a Lavvu that required so many hides, so much labor. Aslak and Ellen worked together, their hands moving in a familiar, practiced rhythm. They cut the hides into shape, they stitched them together with sinew thread, they reinforced the seams with strips of leather. They created 2 separate coverings, an inner and an outer, each one a perfect conical shape, each one designed to fit snugly over the wooden frame. The outer covering was made from the thick, heavy bull hides, their fur facing outwards to shed the snow and rain. The inner covering was made from the lighter, softer calf hides, their fur facing inwards to trap the heat and provide a soft, comfortable interior. The 2 coverings were separated by a gap of about 10 centimeters, an airspace that would act as a powerful insulator. Aslak had also designed a system of vents and flaps that would allow him to control the airflow. He created a series of small circular openings at the base of the outer covering, openings that could be closed with a simple drawstring. He also created a larger adjustable flap at the top of the inner covering, a flap that could be opened or closed to regulate the flow of warm air into the air gap between the 2 layers. The final element of his design was the smoke hole. In a traditional Lavvu, the smoke hole was a simple opening at the top of the tent, an opening that was always left at least partially open to allow the smoke to escape. But this also allowed the heat to escape. Aslak had designed a new kind of smoke hole, a double-walled chimney made from 2 concentric rings of reindeer hide. The inner ring would channel the smoke from the fire, while the outer ring would create a dead air space, a thermal barrier that would prevent the heat from escaping. He completed the furnace tent on November 15th, just as the first major snowstorm of the winter began to fall. It was a magnificent structure, a testament to his skill, his ingenuity, his unwavering determination. It was larger than any Lavvu he had ever seen, its dark, conical shape a stark, imposing presence against the white, windswept landscape. It was a fortress against the cold, a sanctuary against the storm. It was a furnace waiting to be lit. That night, as the wind howled and the snow fell, Aslak and his family moved into their new home. They lit a fire in the central hearth, the flames leaping and dancing, casting a warm, flickering light on the faces of his wife and children. They sat in a circle around the fire, their bodies bathed in its warmth, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and anxiety. This was the moment of truth. This was the night they would find out if the furnace tent would work. Part 3. The first few weeks in the furnace tent were a revelation. From November 16th through December 10th, 1785, the family lived in unprecedented comfort. Aslak had installed a simple thermometer, a device he had acquired from a Norwegian trader in Karasjok on August 20th, and he meticulously recorded the temperature inside and outside the tent each day. On November 20th, when the outside temperature was minus 20 degrees Celsius, the inside temperature was a comfortable 15 degrees. On November 28th, when the outside temperature dropped to minus 25 degrees, the inside temperature remained at 14 degrees. On December 5th, during a particularly cold snap, when the outside temperature plunged to minus 32 degrees, the inside temperature was still a livable 12 degrees Celsius. The double-layered design, the air gap, the adjustable vents, the double-walled smoke hole, it all worked, even better than Aslak had dared to hope. The tent was a cocoon of warmth and comfort, a sanctuary against the brutal Arctic winter. The fire in the central hearth burned brightly, its smoke rising in a clean, straight line up the inner chimney. The outer chimney drew the warm air from the living space and circulated it through the air gap between the two layers of reindeer hides, turning the entire tent into a giant, radiant heater. The air was fresh, it was clean, it was free of the thick, choking smoke that was a constant feature of life in a traditional Lavvu. The children, who in previous winters had been plagued by coughs and colds, were healthy and full of energy. Ellen, who had always suffered from the cold, was now warm and comfortable, her hands no longer chapped and raw, her face no longer pale and drawn. Aslak's furnace tent became the talk of the Sida. The other herders, their skepticism replaced by a grudging admiration, would often visit in the evenings, drawn by the warmth and the comfort of the new Lavvu. They would sit around the fire, drinking hot tea, sharing stories, their faces a mixture of wonder and envy. They had never experienced a winter like this, a winter without the constant, biting cold, a winter without the constant, choking smoke. But the furnace tent was not without its problems. The first signs of trouble appeared on December 12th, 1785. Aslak noticed a thin layer of frost forming on the inside of the outer covering, just above the level of the sleeping platforms. By December 15th, the frost had thickened into a layer of ice nearly 1 centimeter thick. By December 20th, the ice was 2 centimeters thick, and it was beginning to block the airflow through the vents. By December 25th, Christmas Day, the ice was 3 centimeters thick, and the temperature inside the tent had dropped to 10 degrees Celsius, despite the fire burning as brightly as ever. The double-layered design, while incredibly effective at trapping heat, also trapped moisture. The warm, moist air from the fire, from the breath of the people and the animals, would rise and condense on the cold surface of the outer layer of reindeer hides. The moisture would then freeze, forming a thick layer of ice on the inside of the outer covering. As the ice built up, it would block the airflow, reducing the effectiveness of the insulation and creating a damp, unhealthy living environment. Aslak had anticipated this problem, and he had designed a system of vents to deal with it. But the vents were not enough. The amount of moisture being generated by the family, by the dogs, by the cooking, was simply too great. The ice continued to build up, a creeping, insidious threat to the integrity of his design. He tried everything he could think of to solve the problem. He tried increasing the airflow, opening the vents wider, but that only let in more cold air. He tried reducing the amount of moisture being generated, cooking outside, keeping the dogs in a separate shelter, but that was impractical in the depths of the Arctic winter. He tried scraping the ice off the inside of the outer covering, a cold, miserable job that had to be done every few days. But the ice always returned, a stubborn, relentless foe. The furnace tent, which had at first seemed like a perfect solution, was now revealing its flaws. It was a machine, a complex, finely tuned instrument, but it was a machine that was out of balance. It was a furnace that was slowly, inexorably, drowning in its own steam. The crisis came to a head on January 10th, 1786. The ice on the inside of the outer covering had reached a thickness of nearly 5 centimeters. The airflow through the vents was almost completely blocked. The smoke from the fire, which had been rising cleanly through the double-walled chimney, was now beginning to back up into the living space. On the morning of January 10th, Aslak woke to find the tent filled with a thin, acrid haze. By midday, the haze had thickened into a choking cloud. And then, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the blizzard hit. A fierce blizzard, even more powerful than the one that had killed his son the previous winter, swept across the Finnmark plateau. The wind howled, a shrieking, demonic fury. The snow fell in a thick, blinding curtain. The temperature plunged to 40 degrees below freezing. The furnace tent, which had so far been a sanctuary against the cold, was now a trap. The ice on the inside of the outer covering had become so thick that it had completely blocked the airflow. The smoke from the fire, unable to escape through the chimney, began to fill the tent, a thick, acrid, choking cloud. The air, which had been so fresh, so clean, was now a toxic, unbreathable soup. The family huddled together in the center of the tent, their eyes streaming, their lungs burning. The children were crying, their small bodies racked with coughing. Ellen, her face pale with fear, looked at Aslak, her eyes a silent, desperate plea. Aslak knew that he had to do something, that he had to act quickly, or they would all suffocate. He grabbed his knife. He crawled to the side of the tent. He began to slash at the inner layer of reindeer hides, creating a series of long, vertical cuts. The cold, fresh air rushed in, a blessed, life-giving relief. The smoke began to clear. The air began to thin. They were saved. But the furnace tent was ruined. The inner layer of reindeer hides was shredded, the carefully constructed air gap destroyed. The tent was now no better than a traditional lavvu, a single-layered shelter against the storm. The cold began to seep in, a familiar, unwelcome guest. The dream of the furnace tent, the dream of a winter without cold, without fear, was over. Part 4. The blizzard raged for 3 days and 3 nights. The family huddled together in the ruined furnace tent, their bodies wrapped in furs, their faces grim. The fire in the central hearth, which had once been a source of warmth and comfort, was now a source of anxiety, its smoke a constant irritating presence. The cold, which had been banished for a few glorious weeks, had returned with a vengeance, a relentless, numbing foe. Aslak was a man defeated. He had tried. He had failed. He had dared to challenge the old ways. He had dared to dream of a better life. But the Arctic winter had proven to be a more formidable adversary than he had imagined. He had saved his family from suffocation, but he had condemned them to a winter of cold and misery. He had failed them, just as he had failed his son the previous winter. But Ellen, his strong, practical wife, would not let him despair. She had seen the genius of his design. She had experienced the warmth and the comfort of the furnace tent. She knew that he had been on the verge of a breakthrough, that he had been defeated not by a flaw in his design, but by a single unforeseen problem. She would not let him give up. On the fourth day, January 13th, 1786, the blizzard finally broke. The storm had raged for 72 hours without pause. The wind had howled at speeds exceeding 120 kilometers per hour. The temperature had dropped to a bone-chilling 45 degrees below freezing. The snow had fallen in such quantities that it had buried the lower half of the tent, creating a thick, insulating bank that had, ironically, helped to keep the family alive. The wind died down. The snow stopped falling. The sun, a pale, watery disk, appeared on the horizon. The world was a sea of white, a vast, silent, frozen landscape. Aslak emerged from the tent, his heart heavy with despair. He looked at the ruined furnace tent, its shredded inner layer, a testament to his failure. He was ready to give up, to return to the old ways, to accept his fate. But then he saw something that made him stop, that made him look again. He saw the way the snow had drifted around the tent, the way it had formed a thick, insulating bank around the base. He saw the way the wind had scoured the snow from the top of the tent, leaving the smoke hole clear. He saw the way the sun, low on the horizon, was casting long, dark shadows across the snow. And then he understood. He understood the problem, and he understood the solution. The problem was not the moisture. The problem was the ice. The moisture was a natural byproduct of life. It could not be eliminated. But the ice could be controlled. The ice could be managed. The ice could be turned from an enemy into an ally. He realized that his mistake had been to try to fight the ice, to try to eliminate it. He should have worked with it. He should have used it. He should have created a system that would allow the moisture to condense and freeze in a controlled way, a way that would not block the airflow, a way that would actually enhance the insulation of the tent. He had an idea, a new idea, an idea that was even more radical, even more audacious than his first. He would build a new furnace tent, a furnace tent 2.0. But this time, he would not use 2 layers of reindeer hides. He would use 3. The inner layer would be the same as before, a soft, comfortable layer of calf hides. The outer layer would also be the same, a tough, durable layer of bull hides. But in between the two, he would add a 3rd layer, a layer of loosely woven woolen cloth. The woolen cloth, he reasoned, would act as a wick, drawing the moisture away from the inner layer and allowing it to condense on the cold surface of the outer layer. The ice would still form, but it would form on the outside of the woolen cloth, not on the inside of the outer layer of reindeer hides. The air gap between the inner and the middle layers would remain clear. The airflow would be maintained. The furnace would continue to function. It was a brilliant, elegant solution, a solution that was born from failure, from despair, from a deep, intuitive understanding of the laws of nature. It was a solution that would not only solve the problem of the ice, but would also create a tent that was even warmer, even more comfortable than his first design. He shared his new idea with Ellen. She listened, her eyes wide with wonder. She had always known that he was a man of vision, a man of genius, but this was something else. This was a leap of imagination, a stroke of pure, unadulterated brilliance. She gave him her blessing, her full, unwavering support. He then shared his new idea with the other herders in his Sida. They were, once again, skeptical. They had seen his first furnace tent fail. They had seen him reduced to despair. They were not convinced that his new design would be any better. But they had also seen his courage, his resilience, his unwavering determination. They had seen the love he had for his family, the fierce, protective instinct that drove him. They agreed to help him. And so, on January 20th, 1786, in the depths of the Arctic winter, in the midst of the frozen, snow-covered tundra, the work of building the furnace tent 2.0 began. The construction took 16 days, from January 20th to February 4th. On January 22nd, they completed the frame. On January 25th, they finished stitching the inner layer of calf hides. On January 28th, they attached the middle layer of woolen cloth, a loosely woven fabric that Ellen had traded for at the market in Alta on September 10th, 1785. On January 31st, they completed the outer layer of bull hides. On February 2nd, they installed the double-walled smoke hole. On February 4th, they added the final touches, the vents, the flaps, the adjustable openings that would allow them to control the airflow. It was a race against time, a race against the cold, a race against the ever-present threat of another blizzard. But this time, Aslak was not alone. He had his family, he had his Sida, he had the collective wisdom and experience of his people. He had the knowledge that had been passed down through generations of herders, the knowledge of how to survive, how to thrive in one of the most extreme environments on Earth. Part 5. The construction of the furnace tent 2.0 was a testament to the resilience and ingenuity of the Sámi people. The entire Sida worked together, their movements a symphony of purpose and precision. The women stitched the new three-layered covering. The men shaped the poles and raised the frame. The children gathered firewood and tended the animals. They worked from dawn to dusk, their bodies fueled by dried reindeer meat and hot tea. They worked in the face of the biting wind, the driving snow, the numbing cold. They worked with a sense of urgency, a sense of shared purpose, a sense of hope. They were not just building a tent, they were building a future. They were building a new way of life. The furnace tent 2.0 was completed on February 5th, 1786, just as another blizzard was beginning to brew on the horizon. It was a magnificent structure, even more impressive than the first. The 3 layers of reindeer hides and woolen cloth gave it a solid, substantial feel, a sense of permanence, of invincibility. It was a fortress, a sanctuary, a home. That night, as the blizzard raged outside, the entire Sida gathered in the new furnace tent. They lit a fire in the central hearth, the flames leaping and dancing, casting a warm, golden glow on the faces of the people. They sat in a circle around the fire, their bodies bathed in its warmth, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. This was the moment of truth, the final test of Aslak's design. The furnace tent 2.0 performed flawlessly. The 3-layered design, the woolen wick, the controlled condensation, it all worked, just as Aslak had predicted. The tent was a haven of warmth and comfort, a world away from the raging storm outside. The air was fresh, it was clean, it was free of smoke. The temperature was a steady, comfortable 20 degrees Celsius, even as the temperature outside plunged to 45 degrees below freezing. The furnace tent 2.0 was a triumph. It was a victory over the cold, a victory over the storm, a victory over the old ways that had held his people captive for so long. It was a new beginning, a new chapter in the long, proud history of the Sámi people. In the years that followed, Aslak's furnace tent became the standard for all the sitas in the region. The design was copied, it was adapted, it was improved upon. The Sámi, who had once been at the mercy of the Arctic winter, were now its masters. They had learned to live in harmony with the cold, to use its power, to turn its greatest threat into their greatest ally. The furnace tent, which had been born from the grief of a father who had lost his son, had become a symbol of hope, of resilience, of the enduring power of human ingenuity. It was a testament to the fact that even in the harshest, most unforgiving of environments, life can not only survive, but thrive. Aslak lived to be an old man. He saw his children grow up. He saw them have children of their own. He saw his people prosper, their herds grow, their way of life secure. He never forgot the son he had lost, the boy who had died in his arms on that terrible frozen night. But the pain of that memory was now tempered by the knowledge that his son's death had not been in vain. It had been the catalyst for a revolution that had saved countless lives, a revolution that had changed the course of Sámi history forever. On a cold, clear day in the winter of 1825, a young Swedish ethnographer, on a journey to document the vanishing cultures of the North, stumbled upon Aslak's Siida. He was amazed by what he saw. He saw a people who were not just surviving, but thriving in the heart of the Arctic winter. He saw a people who were living in warmth and comfort in a land of ice and snow. He saw the furnace tents, their dark, conical shapes, a stark, beautiful contrast against the white, frozen landscape. He spent the winter with the Siida, learning their ways, documenting their culture, their language, their stories. He wrote about the furnace tents in his journal, describing them in great detail, marveling at their ingenuity, their efficiency, their simple, elegant design. He wrote that the Sámi had not just conquered the Arctic winter, they had tamed it. They had turned it into their servant. His journal, which was published in Stockholm in 1827, was a sensation. It was translated into a dozen languages. It was read by people all over the world. It was the first time that the story of the furnace tent, the story of Aslak and his people, had been told to the outside world. It was a story that captured the imagination of a generation, a story that inspired a new wave of exploration, of discovery, of a deeper, more respectful understanding of the indigenous peoples of the world. And so, the legacy of the furnace tent, the legacy of Aslak the herder, the legacy of a father's love for his son, lived on. It lived on in the stories of the Sámi people. It lived on in the pages of a young Swedish ethnographer's journal. It lived on in the hearts and minds of all who had ever dared to dream of a better way, a warmer way, a more human way, to live in this cold, beautiful, unforgiving world.